Eleanor Montgomery adjusted her $200,000 Chanel dress as she observed her reflection in the mirror of the master suite in her Upper East Side mansion in New York. The reflection showed a 45-year-old woman who could easily pass for 35, thanks to the best aesthetic treatments money could buy. Her perfectly dyed and styled brown hair framed a face that had graced numerous society magazines. "Madam, the driver is already waiting," informed Margaret, the housekeeper, through the intercom. "Tell him I'm on my way down," replied Eleanor, applying a final layer of lipstick. It was another charity event night, one of those occasions where New York's high society gathered to pretend they cared about social causes, when, in reality, they were more interested in flaunting their jewelry and networking. Eleanor knew this. Game well, after all. She had mastered it over the past 20 years as the wife of Richard Montgomery, one of the country's most successful businessmen. Descending the Italian marble staircase, Eleanor passed the massive portrait that dominated the entrance hall, a picture of her and Richard on their wedding day 20 years ago. She barely recognized that 25-year-old woman, freshly graduated from fashion school, who had fallen for the promising businessman 15 years her senior. The smile in the portrait seemed too genuine, too naive. "Madam Eleanor, Mr. Richard called to say he won't be able to attend tonight's event," Margaret informed, interrupting her thoughts. "He had an emergency meeting with the shareholders." Eleanor nodded, showing no surprise or disappointment. It was just another night among many where Richard chose work over her. The emergency meetings, business trips, and unavoidable commitments had become as routine as her spa sessions or lunches with friends. On the way to the event, inside the armored Mercedes, Eleanor checked her phone. Among social media notifications and WhatsApp groups from high society, there was a message from Richard. "Sorry I can't make it tonight. We need to talk when I get back." "It's important." Eleanor frowned. Richard wasn't the type to ask for a conversation. He was usually too busy for that. Something about his tone, even through the text message, felt different. The event was taking place at the Plaza, one of the most exclusive hotels in New York. Upon entering the hall decorated with rare orchids and crystals, Eleanor was immediately surrounded by her usual friends, Patricia, the wife of a banker, and Lucille, married to an agribusiness tycoon. "Eleanor, darling, where's Richard?" asked Patricia, between air kisses. "Last-minute meeting," Eleanor replied automatically. "You know how it is." "They're all the same," commented Lucille, rolling her perfectly made-up eyes. "George has been in Dubai for 2 weeks. He said he's coming back tomorrow, but I bet he'll find some excuse to extend the trip." The evening followed its predictable course. French champagne, whispered gossip, calculated smiles, and a charity auction where everyone made sure to place high bids to showcase their purchasing power. Eleanor won a contemporary art piece for 500,000 reais, not because she particularly liked it, but because it was expected of her. Around midnight, as she was preparing to leave, Eleanor received another message from Richard. "I'm home. Please come as soon as you can. We really need to talk." Something about her husband's unusual insistence bothered her. Richard never asked for her presence like this. Normally, when he arrived late, he went straight to his office or to bed, and they only saw each other briefly during breakfast, if at all. On the way back, Eleanor found herself reflecting on her marriage. When was the last time she and Richard had a real conversation? Not about business, social events, or commitments, but about themselves, their feelings, their dreams. She couldn't remember. The Mercedes passed through the gates of the mansion, and Eleanor felt an inexplicable weight in her stomach. What could be so important to make Richard break his usual routine? As she climbed the steps to the entrance, she noticed the lights in the office were on, as always. But this time something was different. Tonight would change everything, though she didn't know it yet. Eleanor found Richard seated in his favorite chair in the office, a piece of Italian leather that had cost more than a popular car. But there was something different about his posture. The always imposing businessman seemed smaller, more vulnerable. His hands, which usually typed frantically on electronic devices, were still in his lap. "You took your time," he said, without accusation in his voice. It was a simple statement. "The auction ran longer than expected," Eleanor replied, placing her Dior clutch on a side table. "I won a piece by the artist of the moment, I think it will look good in the entrance hall." Richard nodded distractedly, as if the information about the new $500,000 acquisition held no importance, and for the first time in a long time, it truly didn't. "Sit down, Eleanor, please." The formality of the request startled her more than any shout could have. In 20 years of marriage, she had learned to read Richard's subtle cues. The way he held his chin, the slight furrow of his brows, something was very wrong. "I went to the doctor today," he began, and Eleanor felt her body stiffen. It wasn't an emergency meeting with shareholders. Eleanor adjusted herself in the chair, feeling the fine fabric of the Chanel dress brush against her skin. Suddenly, the astronomical price of the piece seemed utterly irrelevant. "The tests," Richard continued, his businesslike voice faltering for the first time, "they weren't good. The diagnosis is complicated." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor looked around the office, the imported mahogany shelves filled with business books, the exorbitantly expensive paintings on the walls, the Rolex watch on the desk, all the symbols of success and power that had defined her life for the past 20 years now seemed like mere meaningless objects. "How long?" she asked, surprised by the coldness in her own voice. "Months, maybe a year with treatment." Eleanor stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the illuminated garden. Outside, the marble fountain continued to gush water, indifferent to the news that had just exploded within those walls. "Have you sought other opinions? We can go to any specialist in the world." "Money isn't an issue," she said, her mind already calculating possibilities, as if this were just another problem that money could solve. "I've consulted the best. The diagnosis is unanimous," Richard replied, with a calmness that deeply irritated her. "But that's not what I want to talk about, Eleanor." She turned to face him, noticing how the office lights highlighted the grey strands at his temples. When had he aged so much? "I want to use this time to reconnect," he continued. "I realized we've lost ourselves along the way. I got lost in business, you in social events. We stopped being a couple and became just partners in a life of appearances." The words hit Eleanor like slaps, not because of their harshness, but because of the truth they carried. It was easier to deal with emergency meetings and constant absences than to face the reality of a marriage that had long turned into a partnership of convenience. "What exactly do you want from me, Richard?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I want us to spend time together, real time, not just sharing the same space at social events. I want to reclaim something of what we had when we first met. Before all this, he gestured vaguely at the luxury surrounding them, "before all of this became more important than us." Eleanor felt tears forming in her eyes but held them back. Years of social events had taught her to maintain composure in any situation. But now that skill felt more like a curse than a blessing. "I'll clear my schedule for the next few weeks," Richard continued. "I'll keep only the essentials for business. We could travel, maybe to that inn in Nantucket where we spent our honeymoon. Do you remember?" She did. She remembered Richard back then, still building his empire, with dreams in his eyes and promises on his lips. She remembered herself young and in love, believing that love would be enough. But now, 2 decades later, she wasn't sure if she could still be that woman. "I need some time to process all of this," she finally said. "You can't just drop news like that and expect me to—" "I know," he interrupted gently. "I don't expect an answer now. I just want you to know that, for the first time in a long time, I have clarity about what really matters." Eleanor nodded mechanically and left the office, her legs trembling beneath her designer dress. She climbed the stairs toward the master suite, her private refuge. She needed to be alone, she needed to think. But as she looked into the same mirror where she had admired herself just hours before, she realized she no longer recognized the woman staring back at her. 3 weeks had passed since Richard's revelation. Eleanor's social calendar, usually packed with commitments, was even fuller, a conscious strategy to avoid the long hours at home. Between charity luncheons, gallery openings, and fundraising dinners, she built a fortress of events that kept her away from the reality she didn't want to face. "You seem different," Patricia observed during lunch at the Ritz-Carlton. "More restless than usual. Did something happen?" Eleanor stirred her untouched drink, a Moscow mule the bartender had prepared with special care for her. It's just the usual chaos. You know how it is this time of year, everyone trying to squeeze in events before the holidays. But Patricia, after 20 years of friendship, knew Eleanor far too well to accept that rehearsed response. Are you sure? You're attending every possible event, even the ones you'd normally turn down. And Richard, I haven't seen him anywhere in weeks. He's busy with some special projects, Eleanor replied, hating the tremor she detected in her own voice. It was at that moment that Edward Almeida walked into the restaurant, tall, tanned, with his well-lived 30s etched into his easy smile. He was the kind of man who naturally drew attention. Eleanor knew him by sight. He was a rising architect responsible for some of the most talked-about projects in the city. Eleanor, what a pleasant surprise. Edward approached the table, his smile brightening the room even more. I was just thinking about reaching out to you regarding that cultural center renovation project. It was a transparent excuse. Eleanor knew he could have contacted her through official channels, but there was something refreshing about his direct approach, something that starkly contrasted with the half-truths and evasions she was used to. Edward, what a coincidence, she smiled, feeling a spark of genuine enthusiasm for the first time in weeks. Why don't you join us? Patricia watched the interaction with barely concealed interest, her sharp eyes catching every nuance of their body language. The lunch stretched on for hours, far longer than planned. Edward had a gift for storytelling, making even the most technical details of architecture sound fascinating. Eleanor found herself laughing genuinely, something she hadn't done in weeks. We really need to schedule a meeting about the cultural center, Edward said at the end of lunch, discreetly sliding his personal card to Eleanor. My cell number is written on the back to make communication easier. That night, upon returning home, Eleanor found Richard in the winter garden, flipping through old photo albums. Her heart tightened as she saw how much more worn down he looked, even after such a short time. Remember this day? He asked, showing a photo of them on a deserted beach in Maui. It was our first trip together even before we got married. Eleanor looked at the photograph. The couple in the image seemed to belong to another life. Young, carefree, genuinely happy. The Richard in the photo wasn't yet the tycoon he would become, and the Eleanor there still dreamed of having her own clothing line before settling into the life of a trophy wife. Those were good times, she replied, feeling the weight of Edward's card in her bag as if it were made of lead. We can have moments like that again, Richard insisted, his voice filled with a hope that made her feel even worse. I booked that inn in Nantucket for next weekend, just the two of us. Eleanor felt panic rising in her throat. The idea of being alone with Richard, away from the distractions of social life, seemed suffocating. I can't, she said quickly. I have the launch of the new museum wing. You know I'm on the organizing committee. The disappointment on Richard's face was like a stab, but she forced herself to ignore it. Maybe another time, he murmured, turning his attention back to the albums. Later, in her closet the size of an apartment, Eleanor held Edward's card, her thumb brushing over the handwritten numbers on the back. Her phone felt like it weighed a ton when she picked it up, but her fingers moved decisively over the keyboard. About that meeting. How about coffee tomorrow? The reply came almost instantly. Perfect, I'll meet you at 3 p.m. at Starbucks in the shops at Columbus Circle. Eleanor looked at her reflection in the mirror, trying to ignore the voice in her head telling her she was making a mistake. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than the crushing weight of the situation with Richard. She felt alive. Coffee at the shops at Columbus Circle turned into discreet dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants, which then evolved into rendezvous at a luxurious flat in Tribeca. Eleanor was surprised by how easily her life split into two parallel realities, the devoted wife everyone knew, and the passionate woman who emerged in moments with Edward. You look beautiful when you smile like that, Edward said, watching her. Across the table at the Japanese restaurant in Soho, far from society's gaze. Your eyes shine differently. Eleanor felt her face flush, a reaction she hadn't experienced in a long time. With Edward, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, something she had forgotten how to do over the years of building her social persona. Sometimes I feel like a teenager when I'm with you, she confessed, playing with the wedding ring on her finger. a nervous habit she had developed in recent weeks. "Is that good or bad?" Edward asked, his youthful, carefree smile contrasting with the seriousness in his eyes. "Both," she answered honestly. "It's thrilling and terrifying at the same time." Eleanor's phone buzzed in her bag. It was a message from Richard. "I'm heading to the first treatment session. I wish you were here." Guilt hit her like a punch to the stomach. Richard had started the experimental treatment at a private clinic, and she had made up an urgent commitment to avoid accompanying him. "Is everything okay?" Edward asked, noticing her change in expression. "Yes, just work," she lied, putting her phone away and forcing a smile. Later, in the flat Edward kept especially for their meetings, Eleanor gazed at the city through the 20th floor windows. New York stretched out endlessly, a sea of lights and buildings that seemed as chaotic as her own thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" Edward asked, embracing her from behind. "About how life can change completely in just a few weeks," she replied, leaning back into him. "Sometimes I wonder if I deserve this happiness." "Everyone deserves to be happy, Eleanor," he said, kissing her neck. "You can't keep blaming yourself forever for seeking what makes you feel good." But the guilt was there, constant like a shadow, especially when she returned home and found Richard more downcast each day, battling not just his illness, but also trying to reclaim a marriage she had already abandoned in her heart. One particular night, arriving home after a meeting with Edward, Eleanor was met with a scene that left her frozen. Richard had transformed the sunroom into a romantic dinner setting, with candles, flowers, and an elegantly set table for two. "Surprise," he said, emerging from the dim light with a tired smile. "I thought we could have a moment just for us since you've been so busy lately." Eleanor could still smell Edward's cologne on her skin, and the guilt nearly suffocated her. "Richard, I didn't expect—" "I know," he replied softly. "You haven't expected anything from me for a long time. But I want to change that, Eleanor. We still have time. Time." The word echoed in her mind like an accusation. Time was exactly what they didn't have, and she was choosing to spend the precious moments left in the arms of another man. Dinner was torture, forced smiles and shallow conversation. Richard talked about his plans for the company's future, projects he wanted to pursue, places he wanted to visit, all dreams that now had an expiration date. "Do you remember when we first met?" he asked, pouring more wine. "You had so many dreams. You wanted to create your own fashion brand, revolutionize the market." "We were different back then," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "I ruined your dreams, didn't I? I turned you into a trophy, a social partner. I'm sorry for that, Eleanor. I was selfish." Richard's words hit her with unexpected force. For the first time, she saw clarity in his eyes. He truly understood what he had done to her, to them. That night, lying in her king-sized bed, Eleanor sent a message to Edward, cancelling their meeting the next day. She needed to think. She needed to breathe. Her life had become a maze of lies and guilt, and she no longer knew which path to take. The mirror in her closet, a silent witness to her daily transformations, now reflected a woman torn between duty and desire, between guilt and passion. Eleanor realized she was trapped in a dangerous game where, regardless of the outcome, someone would get hurt, and that someone could very well be herself. Richard glanced at the iPad screen Eleanor had left on the side table in the living room. It wasn't his intention to snoop, but the notification that popped up on the locked screen changed everything. "Edward, I miss you. Our dinner last night was amazing. I can't wait to—" The rest of the message was hidden, but it was enough. The pieces of the puzzle he had been unconsciously putting together over the past few weeks finally fell into place. The increasingly frequent commitments, the different perfume, the distracted smiles at her phone, the elaborate excuses for not accompanying him to his treatment. Sitting in his favorite armchair, Richard felt a weariness that had nothing to do with his illness. 20 years of marriage reduced to a message notification. It was almost poetic, in a painfully ironic way. "Mr. Richard," Margaret, the housekeeper, interrupted his thoughts. "The driver is ready to take you to the clinic." "Thank you, Margaret. One more thing. Have you noticed anything different about Eleanor lately?" The housekeeper, who had served the family for 15 years, visibly hesitated. "It's not my place to comment, sir." "Please, Margaret, I need to know." "Mrs. Eleanor has been going out much more than usual," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "And there are phone calls she prefers to take away from the staff." Richard nodded, dismissing Margaret with a gentle gesture. He picked up the iPad and placed it exactly where it had been, as if he had never touched it. Some truths, he realized, are like poison. Once ingested, there's no turning back. On the way to the clinic, Richard reflected on his life with Eleanor. He remembered her as a young woman, freshly graduated, with dreams bigger than the world. He had promised to help her achieve those dreams, but instead he had turned her into an accessory to his own success story. At the clinic, during his treatment session, he met Julia, a 25-year-old woman who was also battling the same illness. Unlike the other patients, who usually withdrew into their own suffering, Julia radiated a contagious energy. "First time here?" she asked, her smile lighting up the treatment room. "Third session," Richard replied, surprised by how easily the conversation flowed. "Ah, you're still a newbie. I'm on my 12th. I can assure you the cafeteria food gets better after the 5th session, or maybe we just get used to the taste." Richard found himself laughing, something he hadn't done in weeks. "How do you manage to stay so optimistic?" "It's not optimism, it's stubbornness," she replied with a wink. "I figured being sad doesn't help with the treatment, so I decided to be stubborn and find something good in every day. Today, for example, I met a famous businessman who, surprise, knows how to laugh." Julia's simplicity and authenticity were refreshing. During the 2-hour treatment, they talked about everything and nothing: books, movies, dreams, fears. She talked about her project to create a support network for patients like them, something that could bring comfort and hope to those going through the same process. "People think money solves everything," she commented, "but sometimes all we need is someone who truly understands what we're going through." Julia's words echoed in Richard's mind the entire way home. As he watched New York through the car window, an idea began to form in his mind. Perhaps there was a greater purpose in everything he was experiencing. When he arrived home, he found Eleanor getting ready to go out. She looked stunning in a new dress, likely bought especially for the occasion. "Another event?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "Charity dinner at the Waldorf Astoria," she replied, adjusting a diamond earring. "It shouldn't take too long." Richard looked at his wife with new eyes now. She seemed younger, more alive. Ironically, more like the Eleanor he had fallen in love with 20 years ago. The difference was that now that energy wasn't for him. "Eleanor," he called, as she was already at the door. "Are you happy?" The question caught her off guard. For a moment he saw a flicker of guilt in her eyes, quickly replaced by her usual social mask. "What kind of question is that, Richard?" "A simple one. Are you happy?" Eleanor hesitated, her hand clutching her designer bag. "I need to go, I'm already late." Richard watched her leave, carrying with her not just her secret but also 20 years of a shared life. He returned to his office and began making some calls. He had important decisions to make, and for the first time in weeks, he felt strangely at peace with the direction his life was taking. The law firm occupied the entire top floor of a commercial building in the Upper East Side. Dr. Theodore, Richard's trusted lawyer for over 2 decades, watched his client with concern as he laid out his new plans. "Are you sure about this, Richard? This is a considerable fortune you're proposing to redirect," the lawyer questioned, adjusting his thin-framed glasses. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life, Theodore," Richard replied, his voice carrying a serenity that even surprised himself. "I want to create a foundation, something that makes a difference in the lives of people who truly need it." The lawyer made some notes on his iPad. "What about Eleanor? Is she aware of these changes?" "Eleanor is busy with her own life," Richard answered, a sad smile playing on his lips. "But I want you to prepare something special for her as well. A safe deposit box at the bank, with some personal items and a letter." As they discussed the legal details, Richard thought about his most recent conversation with Julia during the treatment. She had shared stories of other patients, people who abandoned treatment because they couldn't afford it, families who gave up everything they had to try to save their loved ones. The money I spent on a single corporate event last year, he reflected aloud, could have funded treatment for dozens of people. Richard, Theodore interrupted his thoughts, you built this empire. Are you sure you want to leave everything to a foundation? I'm not leaving everything, Theodore. I'm finally using it all the right way. That same afternoon, while Eleanor was off on another one of her mysterious errands, Richard visited Julia at her home, a modest apartment in Greenwich Village. She had missed her treatment that day, feeling particularly unwell. Sorry for the mess, she smiled weakly, adjusting herself on the couch. I wasn't expecting visitors today. Richard took in the surroundings. It was a simple but cozy place. On the walls, photos of Julia with friends and family. On a table, stacks of books and an open notebook revealing notes about her support network project. I brought a proposal for you, he said, sitting in the armchair across from the couch. I want to turn your project into reality, on a large scale. Julia's eyes widened as Richard explained his plans for the foundation. It would be a full support center, he continued. Medical treatment, psychological support, financial assistance for families, and I want you to be the face of it all. Me? Julia laughed nervously. Richard, I'm just a literature teacher. Who has more wisdom and humanity than many MBAs out there, he finished. Besides, you understand. You know exactly what these people are going through. As they discussed the details of the project, Richard's phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. Don't wait for me for dinner. Museum committee meeting. He looked at the message expressionlessly, then turned his attention back to Julia, who was enthusiastically sketching her ideas for the support center on a piece of paper. You know, she said without looking up from the paper, sometimes the people who need help the most are the ones who have everything, materially speaking. Richard thought of Eleanor, his marriage, all the things money could buy and all the things it couldn't. You're wiser than you think, Julia. On the way home, Richard asked the driver to pass by the Waldorf Astoria. There was no charity event happening there that night. He saw Eleanor's car parked a few blocks ahead, in front of a discreet restaurant. Through the window, he could see her familiar silhouette next to a young man. She was laughing in a way she hadn't in his presence for a long time. We can go home now, he told the driver. In his office later, Richard began writing the letter that would be left for Eleanor along with the items in the safe. The words flowed with surprising ease. Dear Eleanor, the mirror I leave for you is not a punishment, but an invitation to reflection. What do you see when you look at your reflection? The young woman full of dreams I met 20 years ago, or the woman you chose to become? He stopped writing for a moment, gazing out the window at the city. New York sparkled under the night sky, millions of lights telling millions of stories. Somewhere out there, his wife was living a story different from the one they had planned together, and surprisingly, he was at peace with it. He returned to the letter, determined to turn his final words to Eleanor into something that might, perhaps, help her find her own path to redemption. The Beverly Hills Hotel glowed in its traditional elegance for the most anticipated charity event of the year. The creme de la creme of American society had gathered for the National Health Support Foundation's gala dinner, and Eleanor Montgomery, shone in her exclusive Chanel gown, greeting guests with her perfectly rehearsed smile. Eleanor, darling, Patricia approached, accompanied by her banker husband. I didn't expect to see you here today. Richard told me you had other plans. Eleanor frowned slightly. It was the first she had heard of other plans. In fact, she had barely seen Richard. In recent days, he had been spending more and more time away from home, wrapped up in something she hadn't bothered to ask about. There must have been some misunderstanding, she replied softly, sipping her champagne. Speaking of Richard, Patricia continued, lowering her voice, did you know he's been visiting that specialized clinic regularly? I heard he's developing some kind of social project there. The champagne suddenly tasted bitter in Eleanor's mouth. It was strange to hear about her own husband's life through social gossip. Stranger still was realizing she didn't care as much as she should. Her phone buzzed discreetly, a message from Edward. I miss you. How about a rendezvous after? The event? Before she could respond, the lights in the hall dimmed and the Master of Ceremonies took the stage. It was time for speeches and tributes, the part that Eleanor normally found the most tedious at these events. "Ladies and gentlemen," a deep voice echoed through the hall, "today we have the honor of announcing a groundbreaking initiative in the field of health and social support." Eleanor grabbed another glass of champagne from a passing waiter, barely paying attention to the speech. Her thoughts drifted to Edward, to their secret meetings, to the forbidden excitement that had reignited her life. "And it is with great pleasure that we announce the main donor and visionary behind this project, the businessman Richard Montgomery." The glass nearly slipped from Eleanor's fingers. On the event screen, an image of Richard appeared alongside a young woman. Beautiful, radiant, appearing to be in her early 20s. They were in what looked like a medical center, smiling at each other with obvious complicity. "Mr. Montgomery, along with our ambassador Julia Santos, is revolutionizing the concept of support for patients undergoing treatment," the host continued. "With an initial contribution of over 500 million reais." A wave of murmurs swept through the hall. Eleanor felt all eyes turn to her, some curious, others sympathetic. Patricia placed a hand on her shoulder. "Did you know about this?" her friend whispered. Eleanor didn't respond. On the screen, Richard continued to smile next to that Julia, while the host detailed plans for what would become the largest patient support center in the country. "And I cannot fail to mention," the host's voice softened, "the inspiring story behind this project. As many of you know, Mr. Montgomery himself is facing his own personal battle with illness. But instead of succumbing to despair, he has chosen to transform his experience into hope for others." The words hit Eleanor like slaps. There, in front of high society, her husband was being elevated to the status of a hero while she— what was she? The absent wife? The traitor? Her phone vibrated again, another message from Edward. But for the first time, the idea of meeting him didn't bring the usual wave of excitement. Instead, she felt only a deep emptiness. "And now," the host continued, "let's give a round of applause to Mr. Montgomery and his tireless dedication to this cause." The room erupted in applause. Eleanor clapped mechanically, her mind a whirlwind of confused thoughts. The images continued. On the screen, Richard visiting patients, speaking with doctors, always with Julia by his side. "Eleanor," Patricia whispered again, "are you okay? You look pale." "I need air," she replied, heading to the hotel balcony. The New York night stretched out before her, the city lights reflecting on the dark ocean water. Her phone vibrated once, more, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she stared at her reflection in the balcony glass, an elegant woman in an expensive dress, looking utterly lost. Inside, the applause continued. The host's voice still echoed, listing the details of the project and praising Richard's generosity. Helena realized that while she had been living her secret affair, her husband had been building something meaningful, something that would change lives. The weight of her choices had never felt so real as it did in that moment, under the stars of New York, with the sound of applause for her husband echoing behind her. The flight back to New York was silent. Eleanor gazed at the clouds through the window of the private jet, mentally replaying the events of the previous night. Beside her, the Louis Vuitton bag held the phone that kept buzzing with messages from Edward, all left unanswered. As soon as she arrived home, she found Richard in his office, sorting through papers with an energy she hadn't seen in a long time. He looked up when she entered, his gaze calm and contemplative. "It was an interesting event last night," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. "It was important for the foundation," he replied simply, turning his attention back to the documents. "That Julia, she seems quite young to be leading a project of this scale." Richard looked up again, a faint smile on his lips. "She's the same age you were when we met, and she has the same passion for making a difference that you had back then." The comparison hit Eleanor like a well-aimed blow. She remembered herself at 25, full of dreams and ideals, before the comforts of a luxurious life had turned her into— what had she become? "Why didn't you tell me about the project?" she asked, sitting in the chair across from his desk. "You've been busy," he replied, no accusation in his voice. Besides, I didn't think charity events were your thing anymore, at least not the genuine ones. Eleanor's phone buzzed once again. Edward, we need to talk. It's important. I have a commitment, she said, standing up abruptly. Of course. You do, Richard replied, his voice carrying an understanding that made her feel even worse. The flat in Tribeca seemed different that afternoon. What was once a romantic refuge now felt like just a symbol of her cowardice. Edward was waiting, for her more serious than usual. Why didn't you answer my messages? He asked as soon as she entered. I needed to think, she replied, staying close to the door. Is it about yesterday, about your husband's project? Eleanor walked to the window, looking at the city below. Did you watch the event broadcast? Everyone watched, Eleanor. It's in all the papers today, the philanthropic businessman using his own experience to help others. There was a hint of irony in his voice that bothered her. And what do you think about that? I think your husband is trying to buy redemption, Edward answered, stepping closer, and apparently it's working. Society loves a repentant rich man. Don't talk like that, she turned sharply. You don't know him. And do you? He shot back. Because from what I understand, you didn't even know about this project until yesterday. Edward's words echoed through the apartment with a painful truth. Eleanor felt the tears forming, but held them back. Years of practice in keeping up appearances. We need to take a break, she finally said. That's it? You're going to run back to him now that he's the hero of the moment? It's not that, she replied, but her voice trembled. It's just, I don't recognize the person I'm becoming anymore. Edward laughed bitterly. The person you're becoming? Eleanor, you've always been this person. I just gave you the chance to admit it. She grabbed her bag and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. You're wrong, Edward. And that might be the first truth I've realized in a long time. Back at the mansion, Eleanor found Margaret organizing some old items. Among them was a box with her fashion sketches from college, ambitious designs from a young woman who dreamed of revolutionizing the fashion industry in the United States. Should I store these or donate them, Mum? Asked the housekeeper. Eleanor picked up one of the sketches, running her fingers over the yellowed paper. It was a wedding dress she had designed, inspired by her own marriage to Richard. I'll keep them, she replied, surprising herself. Heading up to her suite, Eleanor passed by Richard's office. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear him on the phone discussing the details of the foundation. His voice sounded excited, passionate, something she hadn't heard in a long time. In her closet, Eleanor stared at her reflection in the mirror. The perfectly made-up face, the expensive jewelry, the million-dollar wardrobe. When exactly had she traded her dreams for all of this? Her phone vibrated again, another message from Edward. But this time, she didn't just ignore the notification, she blocked the number. Sitting at her vanity, she began to sketch again, for the first time in years. They were no longer haute couture dresses, but comfortable and practical uniforms for patients in treatment. In the corner of the paper, she wrote, Montgomery Foundation Project Comfort Line. The makeshift studio in the mansion's old guest room was a creative mess. Fabrics scattered everywhere, sketches pinned to the walls, mannequins wearing prototypes in various stages of development. Eleanor, seated in front of the sewing machine she had bought the week before, was adjusting the details of a piece that could revolutionize the lives of patients in treatment. Madam, you have a visitor, announced Margaret, seeming pleased to see her mistress occupied with something other than social events. Miss Julia is waiting in the living room. Eleanor felt a chill in her stomach. After 2 weeks of developing the prototypes, she had finally mustered the courage to schedule this meeting. She fixed her hair, now more natural without the artificial highlights, and went downstairs to meet the young woman who, unknowingly, had helped change the course of her life. Your designs are incredible, Julia commented, looking through the portfolio Helena had prepared. I never thought hospital clothing could be so dignified. Dignity is exactly the point, Helena replied, surprising herself with her own passion for the subject. When we're undergoing treatment, we've already lost so much of our sense of identity. The clothes don't need to contribute to that. Julia smiled. a genuine smile that made Helena understand why Richard trusted her so much to lead the foundation. You know, Richard always said you were talented, but that you'd lost your way along the path. The mention of her husband brought a tightness to her chest. Does he talk about me often? Not as much as you might think, Julia replied diplomatically. But when he does, it's always with a mix of admiration for who you were and sadness for who you stopped being. Helena took a deep breath, gathering courage for the question that haunted her. How is he? Really? Physically. The treatments are tough, but he's strong. Emotionally. He's more at peace than many people I know who don't have any health issues. The silence that followed was filled by the sound of the fountain in the garden. Helena stood up and walked to the window, gazing at the spot where not long ago Richard had attempted a romantic dinner she had dismissed. I want to help, she finally said, turning to Julia. Not for Richard, not to clear my conscience, but because I finally found something that makes sense. The foundation would be honored to have you, Julia smiled, but I need to be clear. This won't be a charity project to fill your free afternoons. We need real commitment. I don't want it to be just a project, Eleanor replied, returning to the table and spreading out more sketches. I want to create a full clothing line that can be worn during treatment, pieces that make medication access easier, but look like regular clothes, something that makes people feel human, not just patients. As she explained her plans, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. It wasn't the superficial thrill of buying a new designer bag or the forbidden excitement of her encounters with Edward. It was something deeper, more genuine. You've really changed, Julia observed. I'm trying, Eleanor corrected. I still have a lot to fix. That night, after Julia left with the prototypes to present to the Foundation's team, Eleanor found Richard in his office. He looked more worn out after his latest treatment session, but his eyes still held a determined glimmer. Julia told me about your designs, he said, without looking up from the papers he was signing. They're truly impressive. Thank you, she replied, sitting in the chair across from his desk. Richard, You don't need to say anything, he interrupted her gently. Sometimes actions speak louder than words. Eleanor nodded, feeling the tears she had been holding back for weeks finally stream down her face. I'm sorry for everything. Richard finally looked up, his gaze carrying not anger or resentment, but an understanding that made her feel even smaller. I'm sorry too, Eleanor, for turning you into something you weren't, for suffocating your dreams with material comfort. It wasn't your fault, she whispered. They were my choices, every single one of them. The silence that followed was no longer filled with pain and secrets. It was a silence of mutual understanding, of forgiveness, not to rebuild what was broken, but to allow something new to rise from the ruins. I noticed you turned the guest room into a studio, he remarked. I hope you don't mind. On the contrary, he smiled faintly. It's good to see that space being used to create something meaningful. Eleanor stood up, walking to the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. You did it, you know. Did what? Made me see my true reflection. Even before the mirror you're planning to leave behind. The shock on Richard's face confirmed what she had already suspected. He had never imagined she would discover his plans for the future. But now, for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt no fear of that future. She was ready to face it, no longer as the trophy wife of the Montgomerys, but as herself, rediscovering the woman she had lost along the way. 6 months later, Eleanor stood before the mirror in her closet, but this time not to evaluate a new designer dress. She was wearing one of the pieces from her collection for patients in treatment, an elegant set in soft tones that strategically concealed access points for medication. It was the day of the official launch of the Dignity line at the Montgomery Foundation. The press has started to arrive, Margaret informed her, her voice carrying barely concealed pride. Miss Julia asked me to let you know that everything is ready in the auditorium. Eleanor nodded, adjusting one last time the necklace Richard had given her on their first wedding anniversary. A simple piece from a time when he wasn't yet the tycoon he would become. It was the only accessory she wore today, a silent reminder of simpler, truer times. The Montgomery Foundation auditorium was packed. In the front rows were patients wearing prototypes of the Dignity collection, real people who had participated in the development process, offering valuable feedback on each piece. Among them was Richard, thinner and more worn, but with a serene smile on his face. Julia opened the event, her infectious energy filling the room. Today, we're not just launching a clothing line, we're giving back something precious to those in treatment, the right to feel human, dignified, beautiful. When it was Eleanor's turn to speak, she set aside her prepared remarks. She looked at the people before her, not as the socialite she once was, but as someone who had finally found her purpose. I spent years of my life hiding behind social masks and expensive clothes, she began, her voice steady. It took extreme circumstances to make me realize I was suffocating my true dreams. This collection isn't just about functional and beautiful clothes for patients in treatment. It's about restoring dignity, about looking in the mirror and recognizing yourself, even in the most difficult moments. Her eyes met Richard's in the audience. He smiled, a subtle gesture that carried understanding and forgiveness. Every piece in this collection was created with love, respect, and above all listening. We listen to every patient, every family member, every healthcare professional, because only those who live this reality truly know what they need. After the presentation, as the guests admired the pieces on display, Eleanor found Richard in a private moment. "You did it," he said simply. "We did it," she corrected. "Without you, without the foundation, this would never have happened." "Without your transformation, you mean?" he smiled. "You know, I may have provided the mirror, but you chose to truly look into it." Eleanor felt the tears forming, but this time she didn't hold them back. They weren't tears of sadness or guilt, but of gratitude and understanding. "The safe," she began. "You don't need it anymore," Richard gently interrupted. "You've already found your own answers." That night, after the event, Eleanor returned to her studio. Among the fabrics and sketches, she found an envelope that hadn't been there before. Inside was a letter from Richard. "Dear Eleanor, when I planned to leave a mirror for you in the safe, I wanted it to serve as a tool for reflection, but you didn't need it to find your true reflection. You chose to look inward on your own, and that made all the difference. Your transformation doesn't erase the past, but it illuminates the future. Seeing you reclaim your dreams and use them to help others gives me the peace I need to leave when the time comes. The pendant I plan to leave with the mirror is in the top drawer of your desk. It's no longer a reminder of what we lost, but a celebration of what you've rediscovered. Your essence. With love, Richard." Eleanor opened the drawer with trembling hands. There it was, the pendant, a small white gold sewing needle, the first gift she had ever given him, symbolizing her dreams of becoming a designer. She placed the pendant around her neck and walked to the window. The garden of the foundation stretched out under the twilight, with patients strolling in their new outfits from the Dignity collection. Somewhere down there, Richard was likely talking to Julia about upcoming projects, tireless in his mission to transform lives until the very last moment. Eleanor touched the pendant and smiled at her reflection in the window pane. She was no longer the shallow socialite, nor the remorseful wife. She was simply herself, imperfect, a work in progress, but finally true. On the horizon, the sun set over New York, painting the sky with hues of hope. It was the end of a day, but for Eleanor, it was just the beginning of her true story.